Hi everyone, this is Dr. Katie Lynch at Rockland Community College, and I'm creating a brief video on how to get started with the literary analysis assignment for pretty much any English class that's dealing with poetry, fiction, drama, any kind of piece of literature, including even some of this advice would work for television and film. And for my own students, this is for your close reading assignment in English 104. And I'm going to demonstrate the kinds of skills and the process that you want to go through when you are trying to come up with a debatable claim, a thesis statement for a literary analysis essay. Now, you all are working on a close reading assignment, which is a very short assignment. It's 2 pages minimum. And that assignment asks you to pick out a word, phrase, image, motif, theme, some sort of fundamental building block of one of the texts that we've been reading in our unit, and then develop an argument about the significance of that thing that you've chosen for the entire text. And I'm going to demonstrate how to do this by recording this video about Mary Oliver's poem, Wild Geese. This is probably my favorite short poem in the world. And obviously, this is a different kind of text than what we're working with. We're working with creation stories, but the core process remains the same. Okay, so first of all, you need to read the text. That's really important. And then, as we've discussed, you need to reread it. But we're just going to read it together really quickly here. I'll read it out loud. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the clean blue air, are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over, announcing your place in the family of things. So I'm not going to get into all the reasons why this is one of my favorite poems ever, but we now have an assignment, right? We need to choose a word, phrase, image, motif, theme, something, one of those fundamentals of the poem, and then we need to make an argument and create a claim about why that's significant to the piece. So one of the first things that you want to do is you want to look at what some of the key words are in this poem. And the poem's title is Wild Geese. So right away, we know that geese may be important to the poem. They may not be. The title doesn't always indicate what's important to the poem. But we can see that the phrase wild geese is repeated twice, once here and once here in the bottom of the poem near the end. But there might be other pieces of repetition that we latch onto. And the reason I call out repetition is because when we do close reading, we assume that every choice made by the author is significant. This may not be true in reality. It's possible that it's not true, but it doesn't matter. We're going to assume that. And so what we assume is that every single word has been chosen very intentionally by the author, in this case, the poet. And so when a word is repeated, then that must be important, right? Because if every choice is intentional, then repetition means that that word or phrase is being used over and over to emphasize something. So one of the best things you can do when you are trying to analyze a piece of literature is to look for ideas that are repeated, words and phrases, images, and right away we see a few. The word you, a very simple word, but the word you is repeated a lot. You, right? So if we count them up, 1, 2, 3, and if we add your, we'd get even more, right? So 4, 5, okay? And then we get a break here from the yous, and that's interesting. There's a whole part of the poem where there's no yous at all. And then at the end, there's more, right? 6, 7, there's a your, 8. So you can see that in the beginning of the poem, there's a cluster of yous and yours, and at the end of the poem, there's a cluster of yous and yours. That may or may not be significant, but we should take notes on that. So we'll come over to a Google Doc and we'll say, thoughts on Mary Oliver's Wild Geese, okay? And I'm just taking notes now. I'm noting my observations These aren't arguments, they're not claims yet, they're just observations. So there is repetition of you and yours throughout the poem. There is a cluster of you and yours in the beginning of the poem and at the end of the poem. Now, we don't know what this means yet. We have no idea if we're going to be able to create a claim out of this, but we've noticed that. Let's think about what else we're going to notice. Not only is you repeated and yours repeated, but there's also a whole phrase that is repeated. You do not have to be good, right? You do not have to walk. This is, you do not have to and verb. You do not have to and verb. That's called parallel structure. And even if we don't know that it's called parallel structure, we can tell that the same kind of construction is being used twice in a row in a sort of refrain. That's interesting, right? So we're going to take note of that. The first two lines repeat, you do not have to, okay? Plus verb. Again, I don't know if that's going to be significant in the end, but I want to write it down, okay? Now, one of the other things we may have noticed is that all this repetition of you is addressing the reader specifically. This is what's called the second person. You, right? The author is talking to you. And then the author does that very explicitly. The poet says, tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine, right? So then we get the first person perspective in here. What it turns out is that we could argue that this use of I, the only use of I, by the way, in the poem, is perhaps creating a conversation, right? Is there a conversation being created between the poet and the reader, right? And we've gotten that just by looking at the pronouns, you and I. So I might take down a note. It feels like, and okay, I've got little typos here, but that doesn't matter. It feels like the poem is a conversation because after the narrator, the voice of the poem, the persona, starts with you, they briefly switch to I before returning to you. Maybe that's important, maybe it's not. We're writing down notes. Now, we've got more repetition, and we can see it pretty clearly if we look at the beginnings of the next few sentences. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun, etc. Meanwhile, the wild geese. So repetition of meanwhile, right? There's repetition of meanwhile. And this has nothing to do, apparently, with you, right? It's no longer talking about you, it's talking about other things. It's talking about the world, talking about the sun and the rain and the landscapes, the prairies and the trees, the mountains and the rivers, the wild geese. So there seems to be some kind of juxtaposition between what is being addressed to you and then the rest of the world. Okay, and that might be interesting. So we're going to say, to juxtapose something means to sort of, put them in contrast with each other, right? So we have, there seems to be you is juxtaposed with meanwhile. So once we've come to these conclusions, let's take a little peek back at the poem here. We want to look at the end of the poem. Whoever you are, okay, whoever you are, there's you again. So this is the first time that we've gotten you since this break, right? Since here. Yours was the last time we got you. Now we have you again at the end of the poem, okay? Whoever you are, the world offers itself to your imagination. Now, we've seen the world before, and we see it up here, the world, okay? So what's happening down here, arguably, is that these two sections of the poem are now being linked. We had the section that was addressed to you, we had the section that was talking about the world, and now we have a section that is addressed to you and that's talking about the world, that's linking you, the reader, with the world, okay? And moreover, it's arguing, the argument of the poem, the message of the poem, I would say, this is what I'm arriving at, yours might be different, but the idea here is that the world is offering itself to you, calling to you, and moreover, announcing your place in the family of things, right? So those things that were seeming to be separate from you, the world, the sun, the brain, the landscapes, the prairies, the trees, the end of the poem tells us that actually you are connected to the world, right? And that the world, the entire world is calling out like the call of wild geese. Most of us, especially those of us who live in New York, where I teach, have seen the wild geese in V formations honking and calling out as they're migrating. And this is a metaphor, right? You're saying that you're using the wild geese as a metaphor. I know this is technically a simile here. Some of you are going to say, no, it's using like, it's a simile. Yes, but similes are versions of metaphors, okay? Metaphor is the umbrella term, and a simile is a type of metaphor. I know that may not be what you learned in the past, but it is the truth. So a simile is a type of metaphor. And this idea that the entire world is calling to you like the wild geese and calling to you in a way that brings you into a relationship, a familial relationship with the world, is a very interesting message for the poem to have. And moreover, we have to think about what the metaphor of wild geese really means. When geese are flying and calling to each other, what do we know about that? Well, we might know that geese are flying in formation in a family unit, and they're doing that to get somewhere. They're migrating, they have a goal. They're going to get to a warmer climate or a cooler climate, whatever their goal is, right? And we might also know that their goose at the front is doing all the work. The goose at the front is breaking the headwind. And the goose at the front will sometimes shift, and somebody else will take its place because, the goose at the front gets tired, right? And they need to rest. So we're starting to kind of see the richness of this metaphor. What does it mean that the world is calling to us like wild geese? Does it mean that the world is, in a way, trying to help us resolve the despair that was opening this poem, right? Because the poem says you don't have to punish yourself, right? You don't have to punish yourself for the things that, have gone wrong. Everybody has despair, but you don't have to punish yourself, because what you need to do, arguably, according to the poem, according to this interpretation that I'm spinning out, is remember that even in the midst of despair, you are connected to everything around you, right? That's the message I get from this poem, okay? So we've talked a lot then about, I don't think we took notes on the world. The world is repeated twice, once at the beginning and once at the end, okay? And so we've thought about the poem, we've reread the poem a few times, we've dug in and we've looked at the very specific word choices of the poem. And, at this point, now we have a bunch of observations about the poem. None of these are a thesis statement, not even one of them, right? Because they are all true things that cannot be disagreed with. So, for example, the word meanwhile is repeated in the poem. Yes, it is, right? There is no debating that the word meanwhile is repeated. The question is, what is the significance of that? What does that mean? And that's where interpretation comes in. That's where you come in as the writer, and you're going to tell us why that is so important. What I'm going to do is I want to talk about the geese. I want to, and I've already hinted at this. And yes, I've already written my thesis, because it takes a lot of work to write a thesis. It's not something I can do in a short video, which is an important message for you to know. It's not something that happens quickly. It's something that happens with study of the poem over and over, with taking these notes, with looking at them and seeing what they mean. But I have latched on to this idea of family. And I think, for me, the poem is about family and about what that means for people in despair, right? And so I'm going to show you my thesis. I'm going to reveal the thesis that I came up with by looking at wild geese, okay? The phrase wild geese. This is my thesis. In her poem, Wild Geese, Mary Oliver uses the image of wild geese in flight to reinforce the poem's central message, that even in the midst of isolating despair, humans can understand themselves as connected to a beautiful and complex world. Okay? That is an argument. It is a claim, because you could argue that no, the image of wild geese doesn't do what I said it does, and that the poem's central message isn't what I said it is, right? So I have to prove this thesis, and we're going to talk about that in just a second. But I also want to point out a really important pragmatic thing here, okay? I have, after talking about Mary Oliver's image of wild geese, I have put the numbers 12, 16 in parentheses. This is a reference to line numbers. I'm going to switch back to her poem. The first reference to wild geese is in line 12. The second is in line 16. I am showing my readers where they can find this image. And it's really important to always be citing, even when you are paraphrasing, as I'm doing right now, but I'm citing the places in the poem where wild geese can be found. Okay, in addition to the title, of course. So make sure that anytime you are referring to the poem, whether it's through a paraphrase or through a quotation, that you go ahead and cite the proper line numbers. Okay, if you're working with something that isn't a poem, you would cite page numbers. If you don't have page numbers, you would use the author of the poem or of the piece of literature. If you don't have an author, you use the title. All of that can be reviewed by looking at MLA citation. You can look at the Purdue OWL. You can look at the Excelsior OWL. There's lots of tools out there for that. Okay, but let's go back to my next mission. My next mission, now that I have a thesis, and guys, it took me a while. Okay, it wasn't a fast process. I had to take notes, look at the poem, and really work on this thesis. And remember, for those of you who don't know me, you won't know this, but I went to school till I was 30. Okay, I have a PhD in literary studies. So, it's hard to write a thesis and it's going to take some time. But now that I have one, I need an outline. I need to build an argument. Okay, so I'm gonna talk about this in terms of points. I don't like talking about it in terms of paragraphs because sometimes you need more than one paragraph to make a point. But I'm gonna say point one here. Okay, point one. Right. So in my first point, if I want to prove that the image of wild geese reinforces the poem's central message that even in the midst of isolating despair, humans can understand themselves as connected to a beautiful and complex world, my first point might be to talk about how that despair is discussed in the poem. So the poem, oops, I don't want to be in bold font here. The poem begins with an articulation of despair that feels isolating because of the repetition of you. Now, note that the repetition of you wasn't in my thesis. It's another part of the poem that I think we have to use here, or I want to use anyway. Because in the beginning of the poem, it's all about you, right? And then we get this understanding that what Mary Oliver's talking about here is despair. The despair comes from the individual. Okay, you is a singular in this case. Arguably, you could argue that it's a plural. You could do that, but I'm going to read it as a singular, especially because she says, "Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine." And my idea here is that that's a conversational moment, right? She's having a conversation with me, the reader. So I would then talk about how the beginning of the poem sets up the despair of the individual. And then that despair is contrasted really sharply by the rest of the world, right? Even on your worst day, the rest of the world goes on. And sometimes that can feel really impersonal, but sometimes that can feel really comforting, right? Yeah, okay, you're having a really bad day. You're having a really bad week or year, as many of us have had. The world is continuing and there is joy in that world. There's the sun, the clear pebbles of the rain, the wild geese are calling, right? And so no matter how lonely you are, the whole world is there to be connected to you if you can only see it. That's what I think the message of the poem is, right? So anyway, my first point is going to be that articulation of despair, and I'm going to bring in that repetition of you to reinforce it. My second point is going to be that that individual despair is juxtaposed with a greater sense of understanding the world as much bigger than the self. Okay, these are not topic sentences. That would be a pretty bad one. These are just thoughts, right? I'm building sort of a little outline here. Point three is going to be about reconciling the despair of the individual with the connectedness of the world. And what I mean by that is, here at the end, no matter how lonely you are, the whole world is there connected to you. You just need to perceive that. That's what I mean by reconciling. The despair of the individual, the continuation of the world, right? That's we reconcile those at the end of the poem. My fourth point is going to be specifically about how the wild geese, as a phrase, it evokes family, familial connection, and nature, right? And we see the interconnectedness of the world and the individual through this metaphor, right? The world is inviting you to be a part of its family, just like the wild geese are a family. It's not always going to be easy, but you are still part of that family, okay? And I might go on and have a few more points. I might reorganize these points, okay? I might put 2 points in one paragraph and decide that another point needs 2 paragraphs. But I've got a little bit of a plan here. And so in doing this and recording this video, what I'm hoping to show you is that, the process of literary analysis is a process of reading, of rereading, of digging in, of thinking really deeply about how the choices, the individual choices within the poem, contribute to the message of the poem or the short story or the novel or the play or whatever it is that you're reading. But that's the kind of work that's required, that really deep digging into the word choices and the choice of imagery and the metaphors and the symbolism. And we're reading ethically. We're not just making up an idea, right? We are letting the evidence that we find in the poem lead us to a thesis, lead us to a claim. We're not just imposing a claim from the top down. We're starting with the fundamentals, with the building blocks of the poem, and we're letting those building blocks build us and an architecture of an argument. So I hope this has in some way been useful to you as you're working on your own literary analysis, and I appreciate your attention.